It's my pleasure to invite Or Scharf from University of Haifa, and he will talk to us about Martin Buber and the politics of Hebrew.
Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the organizers and especially Netta for this wonderful conference, and also to Professor Mendes-Flohr, who's here, for seeing through the completion of Martin Buber Werkausgabe, and for the general inspiration that he gives us all as a scholar and as a mensch. I will pick up from where Dina has left us, more or less, just addressing similar issues from a completely different angle, which is Buber's relationship with Hebrew. In his author's preface to the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Ludwig Wittgenstein famously states, and I quote, "Thus, the aim of the book is to set a limit to thought, or rather, not thought, but to the expression of thought. It will therefore only be in language that the limit can be set, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense," end quote. In the Tractatus, the language analyzed is language as such. Wittgenstein does not distinguish, nor does he make allowance for, specific different languages. Hence, based on this work, the Tractatus, we cannot construe the limit between languages. We cannot calculate the distance between choshech, darkness, and finsternis, or grasp the fundamental singularity of Bereshit over and against the predictability of in the beginning or im Anfang. A few years after Wittgenstein wrote his seminal study in Vienna, Walter Benjamin prepared in Berlin his introduction to translations of Baudelaire's Fleur de Mal. In the introduction, known as the Task of the Translator, Benjamin illustrates the unconquerable space between languages with the word bread. The German Brot, or the French pain, he says, each bear distinct cultural charges unique to their respective languages. The signification of the same term, or even the very same object, is registered differently, and in a manner of speaking, even tastes differently in each language. In my talk today, I would like to focus on the political aspect of the transition between languages, not by a hypothetical speaking subject, but as befits the occasion, by Martin Buber. In stark contrast with the abstraction of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, the discussion will foreground the historical circumstances that framed Buber's relationship with Hebrew. The title, The Politics of Hebrew, indicates the sphere of life in which Buber's use of Hebrew will be examined. That is, not necessarily in the sense of partisanship, activism, and public confrontation, but also, and perhaps more emphatically, in the sense of subtle yet powerful undercurrents that often shape social, cultural, and intellectual reality more decisively than parliaments and governments do. In the sphere of the political, perhaps no Hebrew word embodies the distance between languages more convincingly than Zionism. To begin with, unlike in most other languages, the Hebrew noun tzionut is not an ism. In Hebrew, addition of the suffix ut to nouns denotes an object that embodies an abstract quality, such as responsibility, achrayut, fanaticism, kanaut, or creativity, yetziratiyut. Or alternatively, physical traits such as dexterity, zrizut, or acrobatic ability, lulyanut. In contrast, in Latinate languages, as a self-standing noun, ism denotes, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and I quote, a distinctive doctrine, cause, or theory, or an oppressive and especially discriminatory attitude or belief, end quote. As a suffix, it similarly refers to the aforementioned qualities, or, quote, adherence to a system or class of principles, end quote. Consequently, Hebrew envelopes tzionut organically in a manner that other languages do not. Throughout his career as a public speaker, Buber thought and spoke of Hebrew and Zionism as two elements intertwined by the aspiration to bring about a Jewish Renaissance. This is persuasively described in Mark Wolowicz's recent book, German as a Jewish Problem, in which he follows Buber's evolving and changing statements on the function of the Hebrew language throughout his involvement in the Zionist movement. Yet, Buber's relationship with Hebrew anteceded his public leadership by many years. Having been raised at the home of the renowned scholar and man of letters, his grandfather Solomon Buber, the young Martin was not only exposed to the language of the Bible and the rabbinic sages, his immersion in the study of canonical Hebraic texts instilled deeply ingrained familiarity with the historical strata of the Hebrew language. Paul Mendes-Flohr emphasizes that the dominant register that Buber the elder passed on to his grandson was, quote, the literary, flowery language of the Haskalah, end quote. That is, Martin's command of Hebrew solidified in childhood and early adolescence, inculcating the register that was the immediate predecessor of the modern Hebrew spoken in Palestine and written by personal acquaintances of his, such as Michal Yosef Berdichevsky, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and his close friend Shai Agnon. These circumstances naturally engendered in Buber intimacy with and confidence in his knowledge of Hebrew, tinged, however, by estrangement. From his earliest days as a Zionist activist, Buber frequently mentioned Hebrew and reflected on its constitutive role in shaping a modern future for the Jewish people. His insecure use of the language in its modern incarnation, of which he sometimes confessed, eschewed the credibility of his call on generations of young Jews to learn Hebrew as part of their participation in the Zionist cause. Barbara Schaefer has stressed the apprehension that accompanied Buber's lifelong relationship with Hebrew, associating it, among other reasons, with his being deprived of a mother tongue. According to her, linguistically, and I quote, Buber was orphaned, end quote. She points out an achingly candid confession he made at the Congress of Hebraic Culture in Berlin, 1909, and that's the text behind me. I followed the invitation of the committee to open the discussion of the Congress with some trepidation. The most serious reservation I had was the fact that I have to speak about the Hebrew language in another language because I'm not able to think in Hebrew, and I cannot bring myself to translate thoughts that I think in a foreign language into my own, but less familiar language. As the prospects of a move to Palestine became increasingly concrete from the late 19-teens onwards, this paradox became nothing short of an embarrassment. His friend, admirer, and colleague, Hugo Bergman, implored Buber to become fluent in Hebrew for more than 2 decades. 2 off-sided letters of Bergman's from 1919 and 1938 are part plea, part remonstrance against Buber's repeated avoidance of the challenge. In the later missive of the 2, Bergman indicated that an emotional barrier was holding his friend back from becoming fully immersed in Hebrew, and I quote, "It seems to me that your real work still lies ahead of you. It should start by your saying farewell to the German language and by telling the Jewish people what you wish to tell them in plain and simple Hebrew. Anyhow, the richness of your German has tempted you more than once." It is important to note that Bergman's concern in this letter was not only personal or ideological, but also professional. As rector of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he was anxious to ensure that Buber would successfully fill the newly founded chair of sociology created especially for him. Buber stood up to the challenge. As Mendes-Flohr relates in his recent biography, before fleeing Germany in 1938, Buber practices colloquial Hebrew with none other than Abraham Joshua Heschel, and received further training and guidance in Jerusalem by Hebraist Fritz Raphael Ornstein. Before too long, Buber was able to prepare his Hebrew lectures in Jerusalem by himself and, as Bergman had pleaded with him, wrote and published Hebrew texts. This was not only an impressive achievement of a man over 60 acquiring fluency in his secondary language, I would like to suggest that his late bloom as a Hebrew author uncovers a secret that even Buber himself may not have been fully aware of. The frailty of his linguistic competency, for which he apologized over decades, was underlain by a forceful grasp of the substance of Hebrew, on its history, structure, and spiritual potential. The insecurity that prevented him from using the language in public before 1938 was antipodal to the naturalness with which his thought was embedded in Hebraic texts and the Hebrew language itself. Buber was cognizant of the organic bond between Tzionut and Hebrew that I have pointed out earlier. In fact, he considered it to reflect upon and to be reflected by Hebrew's cultural and intellectual charge. A private address Buber gave in Prague on the eve of the First World War embodied this understanding of Hebrew and Zionism as inherently interpenetrated by one another. The lecture's title, Zionism as Worldview and Lifeform, Zionismus als Weltanschauung und Lebensform, pithily encapsulate its content. He says, I mean that what every Jew unto himself experiences, an experience that Hebrew motivates, that in the course of his experience, this language becomes ever more Jewish. The Judaizing influence of Hebrew, not through Hebrew texts one reads, not therefore because one acquires certain awe-inspiring primeval knowledge of our people in the original and better understands it. What I mean is, rather, influence that is undefinable yet intimate, of the soul, formal, spiritual. I mean the influence of the form of our thought through Hebrew, the binding together of our sensibilities, and the way through which these sensibilities, representations, and concepts develop, the influence of these processes through Hebrew. At the same time, Buber warns his audience in no uncertain terms that the turn to the Hebrew language should not be construed as a pragmatic support of the nation-making efforts of the Zionist movement. I quote again, one usually observes the learning of Hebrew superficially. We are a nation, therefore we must have a language. We must prepare for Palestine, and Palestine is the land where our tongue is the living language. End quote. All other nations, he adds, consider their language to be the most prized of their so-called goods and wares, the receptacle in which the nation's energy accumulates. Thus, Buber suggests that Hebrew is at a crossroads between two futures, either continuing to serve as a nation-making instrument or becoming the force field that gives shape to Jewish experience and thinking. Buber's aspiration to see the latter future fulfilled derives from a firm conviction in the unique calling of the Jewish people that Dean also spoke about, which should set it apart from all other national projects. He was averse to the call of stated Zionism that the Jewish nation should be like all others, because he wholeheartedly believed that it occludes Jews' access to their divinely bestowed responsibility over all of humanity. Buber's address in many ways presaged 21st century rebuttals of the perception of language as a nation-making instrument. Gil Hochberg, for example, suggests that national language should be imagined as a cultural territory, which, like geographical territories, is, quote, similarly treated as a matter of exclusive ownership, as if it too needs to be protected and guarded against invasions and repopulations, end quote. And hence, it plays a central role in the construction of national identity. Following Derrida, Hochberg emphasizes the exceptional predicament of Hebrew, whose conventional act of nationalization, that Derrida casts as an act of historical violence and deception, simultaneously reinforced its perception as an ethnic, theological language. The year 1938 marked a turning point in Buber's relationship with Hebrew in more respect than one. Before his immigration to Palestine, Buber used Hebrew text as a resource for translation or adaptation into German. Shortly after his arrival in Palestine, Hebrew became the language into which he translated his German works, and in the 1940s, the first language in which his new works were published. Thus, for example, his second monograph on biblical theology, Prophetic Faith, Torat HaNevi'im, first appears in Hebrew in 1942, whereas its German original came out in print only in 1950. The well-known starting point of Buber's reliance on Hebrew as a source language is the free renditions of Hasidic tales, which turned Buber into a literary and intellectual star before he turned 30. Tales of Rabbi Nachman from 1906 and Legends of Baal Shem from 1908. His next milestone contribution, preceded by several more renditions of Hasidic tales, was a translation of the Hebrew Bible in collaboration with Franz Rosenzweig, Die Schrift, published between 1926 to 1930, the books of Genesis through Isaiah. Following Rosenzweig's death, Buber continued alone, completing Psalms and symbolically quitting his work on the book of Job in its midst, upon fleeing Germany to avoid Nazi persecution. A less familiar but highly potent engagement with Hebrew as a source language and a political resource is Buber's publication of translations with the Schocken Publishing House in the years 1933-1939. As Martina Urban has shown in her study, Persecution and the Art of Representation, Buber collaborated with Schocken to disseminate new works by Jewish authors and translations of classic Jewish texts, beginning shortly after the Nazi rise of power in 1933 until the publishing house relocated from Germany in 1939. The book series, Schocken Bücherei, and the annual Almanach des Schocken Verlags were two platforms that Buber initiated and edited as a form of spiritual resistance to National Socialism. The slender volumes of the Bücherei, we saw an example last night in Vivian's presentation, and the Almanach were a show of resilience and a way of providing spiritual sustenance to German Jewry as it witnessed the deterioration of safe, stable existence under Hitler's dictatorship. To circumvent censorship, these publications followed a midrashic technique of inscribing messages of hope and resistance to innocent-looking texts on matters of religious faith and intellectual debate. The opening piece of the first Almanach of the Jewish year 5695, 1934-1935, provides a fine example. Buber's translation of Psalm 22, O God, why hast thou forsaken me, draws on the technique perfected together with Rosenzweig of reflecting multiple valences of the biblical Hebrew, not only as an urtext, but also as a substratum upon which multiple interpretations were laid by generations of Jewish exegetes. One encounters here Buber's command of Hebrew at its height. The confidence with which he approaches the words of the psalmist is undeniable, as this German rendition demonstrates the so-called Judaizing influence of which he spoke in the Prague address 20 years prior. The speaker's existential despair with God's silence in the face of calamity was undoubtedly a painfully familiar experience for the readers of the Almanach. In Buber's hands, however, this plea consoled more than it caused angst. For if Luther's Bible portrays here an indifferent, one could say almost Aristotelian deity, the headpiece of the Almanach insists on God's consoling figure despite its silence. And I don't have time to get into many details, but just for example, Luther translates Divrei Shagati as Ich heule, I howl, and Buber translates it as Die Worte meines Gestöhns. Instead of Hilfe, Yeshua is translated as Befreiung, and there are other examples. The Prague Address contained a detailed description of Buber's vision of a Zionist society, which time, again, does not allow me to present here. There is a fine thread connecting that speech and its emphasis on the potential of the Hebrew language for modern-day Jews, and a slender booklet Buber published under the auspices of the Zionist organization in Palestine in 1942. The booklet, entitled The Concept of Redemption in Hasidism, Musag HaGeula b'Chasidut, was meant to serve as an introduction to Hasidism to be circulated by the organization's Department of Youth Affairs. Its publication serves as one modest example for the fulfillment of the organic bond between Hebrew, Zionism, and Jewish spirituality that Buber had been advocating for decades. Its composition in Hebrew, however, exempted Buber from the encumbering role of mediator of the spirit of Hebrew to native German speakers, a role that had become synonymous with his public persona. In a way, the booklet, as well as other Hebrew publications on Hasidism, such as Hidden Light or Ganuz, or in the Orchard of Hasidism, Bepardes HaChasidut, provided closure for the journey that had begun with the 2 volumes of Hasidic tales that I mentioned earlier. We may discern an interesting parallel between the Almanach and Bushara on the one hand, and the Hasidism booklet on the other hand. Although the tone is instructive, and the content both accessible and illuminating, the text contains subtle references to the non-statist, counter-nationalist brand of Zionism that Buber advocated. The most striking of these references appears on the closing page, where Buber explains the bond between Hebrew as the holy tongue and Israel as a holy land in the thought of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. And this will be my conclusion as well. Buber cites Nachman. Eretz Yisrael, says Rabbi Nachman, is a manifestation of the perfection of the holy tongue. Oh, hang on. For the core of this perfection is made by elevating the good elements in translation from other languages to the loftiness of the holy tongue. This excerpt, I learned for the Martin Buber Werkausgabe, had already appeared in a brief translation that Buber published in the Almanach of 1936-37. It discloses the interconnectedness of land, language, and people that the Hasidic master who visited Palestine in 1798 discerned. In Buber's hands, however, it becomes an inspiring idea with grave potential danger. He turns a text that can readily be appropriated to endow Jewish territorial possession with a spiritual aura into a warning against nationalist myopia. The caution against the use of nation-making as a political instrument becomes here ever more concrete. And I will conclude with this final quotation. Moses Hess famously said that we cannot speculate what would happen should the national movement, that is Zionism, take hold of Hasidism. I'm of the same opinion, because here in Hasidism, we find a phenomenon from recent history whose offshoots reach the present day, a majestic uncovering of spirit and life in which the Jewish people emerges as possessing an internal bond with the world, with the soul, and with God. And only this bond may prevent Zionism from walking down the path of present-day nationalism, which undercuts its own purpose and justification by bringing down the bridges connecting it with the world. Thank you.